Hey warrior, we live in a world that keeps telling you to push harder, move faster, and exhaust yourself in pursuit of everything you want. From the moment you wake up, you're taught that struggle equals progress and that rest is weakness. Hustle culture praises tension. Anxiety is normalized. Burnout is worn like a badge of honor. But the ancient Stoics saw through this illusion long before modern society was born. They understood something most people today never pause long enough to realize. Constant force does not create lasting results. Inner order does. Marcus Aurelius ruled the most powerful empire on earth, while surrounded by war, betrayal, sickness, and political chaos. Yet when he wrote to himself, alone, without an audience, he did not speak about conquering others. He spoke about mastering himself. He wrote, "Confine yourself to the present," not because the future did not matter, but because the present was the only place where power existed. He understood that when the mind stops fighting reality and starts working with it, clarity replaces anxiety and strength replaces desperation. The Stoics were not passive dreamers waiting for life to give them gifts. They were disciplined warriors of the mind. But their strength came from alignment, not tension. Think of water for a moment. Water never panics. It does not argue with rocks. It does not complain about obstacles. It flows, and in time, it shapes mountains. This is the Stoic lesson most people misunderstand. True power does not come from gripping life tighter. It comes from knowing when to release unnecessary resistance. When you obsess over outcomes, when your happiness depends on something arriving exactly the way you imagine, your mind becomes rigid, and a rigid mind breaks easily. Anxiety is not ambition. Desperation is not discipline. The Stoics understood that excessive attachment to results distorts judgment. It clouds perception. It makes you act from fear instead of reason. And fear-driven action rarely produces wisdom. Relaxed intention does not mean giving up. It means acting with purpose while remaining internally free. You plant the seed carefully, but you do not scream at the soil. You show up daily, but you do not punish yourself for what you cannot control. You move forward, but you do not chain your peace to the outcome. This is where modern thinking often goes wrong. People believe letting go means weakness. The Stoics knew letting go was mastery. When you release the need to control everything, your mind becomes calm enough to notice what was always there. Opportunities appear clearer. Decisions become simpler. You stop forcing doors and start recognizing which ones are already open. This is not magic. It is perception without distortion. A stressed mind misses signals. A calm mind sees reality. The Stoics called this amor fati, the love of fate. Not blind optimism, not passive acceptance, but a deep trust that life unfolds according to a rational order beyond your immediate understanding. You still act, you still choose, but you stop declaring war on uncertainty. You stop exhausting yourself fighting what you cannot command. And in that moment, something shifts inside you. You are no longer chasing life. You are walking with it. This is the foundation of everything that follows. Before discipline, before gratitude, before emotional sovereignty, there must be this inner release. Because a mind at war with reality cannot build anything lasting. Only a mind at peace can move with precision, patience, and strength. So take a breath here, not to escape your goals, but to approach them correctly. Say this quietly to yourself. I act with intention, not tension. I trust the process without abandoning effort. This is not the end of striving. This is the beginning of wisdom. Most people believe desire is what drives success. And to a point, that's true. Without desire, nothing moves. But the Stoics made a critical distinction most people miss. Desire becomes dangerous the moment it turns into dependence. The moment you tell yourself, I cannot be at peace unless this happens, you hand your freedom away. You turn your future into a hostage situation. Epictetus understood this from the harshest position imaginable. Born a slave, owning nothing, controlled by others, he reached a conclusion that still unsettles the modern mind. Wealth does not come from having much. It comes from needing little. That statement is not an attack on ambition. It is a warning about attachment. When you need something to feel whole, you give that thing power over you. And whatever has power over your emotional state controls your behavior. Detached desire means this. You pursue what you want with clarity and effort, but you refuse to let the outcome define your worth. You say, "I will work for this," without saying, "I am nothing without this." That difference changes everything. A person who needs success panics under pressure. A person who desires success but remains inwardly free becomes steady, adaptive, and resilient. Look closely at people who seem magnetic, not desperate, not frantic. They move with calm confidence. They are not obsessed with proving themselves. They are not begging reality to cooperate. They act, adjust, and continue. That calm is not luck. It is detachment. They want things, but they do not cling to them. And because of that, their judgment stays clear when others collapse. The Stoics called this preferred indifference. You prefer health, success, love, and abundance. Of course you do. But you are not destroyed without them. Your character remains intact. Your self-respect remains untouched. Your peace remains guarded. When you reach this state, fear loses its grip, because fear needs attachment to survive. Here is the paradox most people struggle to accept. The more you cling, the more you repel. Desperation broadcasts insecurity. Insecurity distorts action. Distorted action produces poor results. Detachment reverses the cycle. Calm creates clarity. Clarity creates better decisions. Better decisions create better outcomes. And even if the outcome changes, you remain stable. This does not mean you stop trying. It means you stop begging. It means you replace anxiety with discipline. You show up, you do the work, and then you release the demand that reality obey you on your timeline. You leave space for life to deliver something wiser than your narrow expectation. Practice this now. Bring one desire to mind, not 10, just one. Feel the pull of it. Then say, "I will act toward this with effort and patience, and I will remain at peace whether it arrives exactly as imagined or not." Notice the tension loosen. That release is not weakness, it is authority. When you desire without chains, you become dangerous in the best way. Calm, focused, unbreakable. Most people are living everywhere except where their power exists. Their body is here, but their mind is trapped in tomorrow or chained to yesterday. They replay mistakes, they rehearse fears, they negotiate with an imaginary future. And while they do this, life keeps moving forward without them. The Stoics saw this clearly. That is why Marcus Aurelius wrote a command to himself, not a suggestion, not a comfort, but a rule. Confine yourself to the present. This was not poetic language. It was survival strategy. Marcus ruled an empire surrounded by war, disease, and betrayal. If his mind lived in fear of what might come or regret over what had already passed, he would have collapsed under the weight. He understood something most people still resist. You cannot act in the past. You cannot act in the future. All action, all clarity, all power exists only now. The present moment is not a spiritual concept. It is a practical weapon. When your attention is fully here, your perception sharpens. You notice details others miss. You hear opportunities hidden inside ordinary conversations. You sense when to speak and when to remain silent. A distracted mind is blind. A present mind sees. Most anxiety is not caused by reality. It is caused by imagined futures. Most regret is not caused by facts. It is caused by mental replays of what cannot be changed. The Stoics refused to bleed over time that no longer existed or had not yet arrived. Seneca warned that people suffer more in imagination than in reality. The present moment, stripped of imagination, is often far more manageable than the stories built around it. There is also something deeper happening when you stay present. Your nervous system settles, your reactions slow, your decisions become intentional instead of impulsive. This is why presence creates what modern people call flow. When the mind is not split between past and future, energy stops leaking, action becomes clean, efficient, effective. Think of the most grounded people you know. They are not rushing mentally ahead of themselves. They are not trapped in endless analysis. When they speak, they are there. When they listen, they are there. This presence creates trust. Trust creates influence. Influence opens doors. None of this is mystical. It is the natural consequence of focused awareness. Here is the irony. The more you try to control the future, the more unstable you become. The more you anchor yourself in the present, the more capable you are of shaping what comes next. Planning has its place, but obsession poisons action. The Stoics planned when necessary and then returned their attention to what was directly in front of them. The next action, the next decision, the next breath. Train this daily. When your mind drifts into what if or if only, bring it back. Not harshly, firmly. Feel your breath. Feel your body. Name what is actually happening right now, not what your mind is inventing. This is not avoidance. This is discipline. The present moment is not passive. It is the point of maximum leverage. From here, you can act. From here, you can respond instead of react. From here, you can build without panic. When you master presence, you stop chasing life. Life begins meeting you where you stand. Most people believe resistance is a sign they are doing something wrong. When plans fall apart, when progress slows, when obstacles appear, they assume life is blocking them. The Stoics saw the opposite. Resistance was not rejection. Resistance was instruction. Marcus Aurelius lived this truth daily. His reign was marked by war, plague, betrayal, and loss. Yet, instead of asking why this was happening to him, he trained himself to ask how it was shaping him. That is why he wrote one of the most powerful lines in Stoic philosophy: "What stands in the way becomes the way." This was not optimism. It was realism, sharpened into strength. Resistance reveals where you are still weak, impatient, attached, or fearful. Without resistance, these flaws remain hidden. Comfort does not build character. Friction does. Every obstacle exposes a skill you have not yet mastered or a mindset you have not yet earned. Most people waste energy fighting reality. They argue with what has already happened. They replay the moment they wish had gone differently. They resist the fact that life does not obey preference. This inner war drains strength faster than any external challenge. The Stoic does something radically different. He accepts first, not because he likes the obstacle, but because he understands that clarity begins where resistance ends. Acceptance does not mean surrender. It means removing emotional friction so action can become precise. When you stop asking why this happened and start asking what this requires of me now, your power returns instantly. Think of resistance like weight on a barbell. Without it, the muscle never grows. With it, applied consistently, strength becomes inevitable. The obstacle is not proof that you are failing. It is proof that you are being trained. Epictetus, born into slavery, did not wait for freedom to live with dignity. He trained his mind inside confinement. He used limitation as discipline. While others waited for conditions to improve, he improved himself within the conditions. That is the Stoic advantage. In modern life, resistance shows up differently. Delays, rejection, uncertainty, silence, unexpected detours. Most people panic here. They rush, they force, they abandon direction. The Stoic slows down. He studies the terrain. He adapts. He understands that impatience is often the real enemy. Ask yourself this when resistance appears. What is this moment trying to teach me about discipline, humility, patience, or resilience? If you extract the lesson, the obstacle has done its job. If you fight it emotionally, it stays longer. Resistance is not personal. Life is not testing your worth. It is testing your readiness. The version of you that reaches the next level must be forged, not comforted. Once you stop seeing obstacles as enemies, fear loses its grip. You move forward without desperation. You stop trying to escape difficulty and start using it. That is when resistance stops blocking your path and starts shaping it. Most people believe power comes from constant movement. If they are not doing something, they feel anxious. If progress is not visible, they assume they are failing. But the Stoics understood a deeper truth. Not all action creates progress, and not all stillness is weakness. Sometimes, the most disciplined move is to wait without panic. Strategic non-action is not laziness. It is restraint guided by clarity. It is the ability to recognize when effort would be forced, emotional, or premature. The Stoic does not move just to feel productive. He moves when action aligns with reason. Modern life rewards busyness, not wisdom. People exhaust themselves chasing outcomes, sending messages that reek of urgency, forcing timelines that are not ready. This frantic motion does not attract opportunity. It repels it. When action is driven by fear, it carries fear into the result. The Stoics practiced patience not as delay, but as positioning. They understood that life has rhythms. There are moments to push and moments to pause. Water does not rush uphill. A farmer does not pull on seeds to make them grow faster. Strategic non-action is the courage to trust that you have already done enough for now. It is the strength to sit in uncertainty without trying to control it. This is incredibly difficult for the modern mind because stillness exposes insecurity. Silence removes distraction. Waiting reveals attachment. But here is the paradox. When you stop forcing outcomes, clarity sharpens. You begin to see options that were invisible when you were anxious. People respond differently to you when your energy is calm. Opportunities surface because you are no longer chasing them blindly. The Stoic knows this. He understands that action taken too early can destroy what patience would have preserved. He does not confuse urgency with importance. He does not confuse effort with effectiveness. Think about how many mistakes are born from rushed decisions. Relationships entered too fast. Words spoken too early. Commitments made from fear of missing out. Strategic non-action protects you from yourself. It creates space between impulse and choice. This discipline requires trust. Trust in reason. Trust in timing. Trust that silence does not mean stagnation. While you wait, internal alignment happens. Your mind steadies. Your intention clarifies. And when action finally becomes necessary, it is precise, clean, and powerful. The Stoic waits without anxiety because his identity is not tied to immediate results. He is not trying to prove himself to the world. He is preparing himself for the moment that matters. If you can master this, you become dangerous in the best way. You stop reacting. You stop chasing. You move when it counts. And when you do, life responds. Strategic non-action is not passive. It is controlled readiness. It is strength at rest. And most people never develop it, which is why they exhaust themselves long before they reach what they desire. Learn to wait without fear. Learn to be still without doubting yourself. That is not weakness. That is mastery. At the end of all Stoic wisdom, there is a truth that feels quiet, almost uncomfortable, yet deeply liberating. You were never meant to force life into submission. You were meant to align with it. The world taught you that control equals power. The Stoics taught the opposite. Power comes from knowing what to release. When you stop gripping outcomes, you stop bleeding energy. When you stop demanding that life obey your timeline, you regain peace. And from peace, real strength emerges. Letting go is not giving up. It is not surrendering your dreams. It is surrendering your illusion that anxiety improves results. It is choosing clarity over chaos, patience over panic, wisdom over noise. Think back to everything you have learned. Detached desire taught you that desperation repels what calm confidence attracts. Presence showed you that power only exists in the now. Acceptance revealed that resistance multiplies pain. while alignment transforms obstacles into pathways. Inner authority reminded you that no external condition controls your worth. Strategic non-action showed you that stillness, when guided by reason, is not weakness but discipline. Gratitude shifted your energy from lack to abundance. Emotional sovereignty returned the throne of your life back to you. The philosophy of enough freed you from endless craving. Authentic expression aligned you with what is truly meant for you, and divine timing asked you to trust something greater than your fear. All of this points to one simple conclusion. Life does not respond to force, it responds to alignment. When you are calm, you see clearly. When you see clearly, you act wisely. When you act wisely, outcomes unfold naturally. This is the Stoic path, not passive, not indifferent, but deeply intentional and grounded. You do not need to chase what is meant for you. What is meant for you recognizes you when you are ready. And readiness is not built through anxiety. It is built through discipline, self-trust, and inner stillness. The Stoics lived through war, loss, exile, and uncertainty far greater than most modern struggles, yet they did not collapse into desperation. They refined themselves, they accepted what they could not change, and mastered what they could. And through that mastery, they lived free, even when circumstances were harsh. Now the same choice stands before you. You can continue to grip, rush, and exhaust yourself, or you can practice the quiet power of letting go while staying aligned with your values and actions. Relaxing does not mean stopping. Trusting does not mean doing nothing. It means you stop fighting the current and start steering within it. It means you act without fear and wait without doubt. This is where manifestation stops being fantasy and becomes philosophy lived daily. Not through visualization alone, but through character. Not through wishful thinking, but through inner order. If you take nothing else from this, take this. Peace is not the reward at the end of success. Peace is the foundation that allows success to arrive. Stand firm. Stay present. Release what you cannot control. Act where you can. And trust that life, when met with wisdom, always responds in time.